There are three major pillars of Dungeons & Dragons: social interaction, exploration, and combat. Like 90% of the player's handbook is rules about combat, and yet so many sessions of D&D combat look like this. All right, I got a 14 to hit. Great, and what's your damage? And that's 7 damage. Awesome. So the skeleton is looking pretty hurt. Do you have anything else that you want to do? Nope, that's it for my turn. Nope. All right. You're up. Hey. Yeah, it's your turn. So how do we create combat that remains engaging and exciting for everyone, no matter how far down the initiative order they are? Well, to identify that, we're going to need a P.E.A.R.L. Yes, P.E.A.R.L, an acronym I definitely didn't just make up, that stands for players, encounters, actions, resources, and layers. Let's take it from the top. While this guide is mostly focused on Dungeon Masters, it's good to remember that players play a huge role in making combat streamlined and fun. Players, make sure you know what you can do in combat, read over your character sheets, understand how your spells work, and make sure that you know how much damage your weapons do. It can be super helpful to create action cards that list out all of the things you can do on your turn. Print out all of your weapon attacks, the different spells that you can cast, and make a note for all the bonus actions and reactions that you can take. The Actions tab in D&D Beyond is a great start, but remember that there are a lot more actions you can take than are listed in this top section. Now that you know what you can do, let's talk about what you want to do. Look, combat and roleplay all too often are separate things, when they really shouldn't be. Think about how your character approaches an encounter. Are they more of a party parent or a Leroy Jenkins? Have an idea of the actions that you'll usually take in combat, and then spice things up on an encounter-by-encounter basis by doing things that aren't in your typical move set. Once you know what you're doing, get into it. Describe that killing blow from your fighter, or the thing that makes your magic look special, or maybe how your rogue darts from the shadows to deal a stealth attack. Most D&D folks know how do you want to do this from Critical Role, but that's something you can use at your table too. DMs, ask your players how they deliver their killing blows. And players, think about how your character would go about killing something. Does your barbarian fly into a rage, hacking limb from limb until very little is left of the thing that once stood in front of them? Maybe your ranger is quick and precise, delivering an arrow to the vitals before turning to the next target without a moment's glance back. Finally, communicate with your fellow players about how you typically approach combat. Are you more of a reserved healer or frontline defender, maybe a barbarian rager? Knowing how you usually play is a great way to bring roleplay into combat as well. Seeing the usually backline healer rush headfirst into a combat will certainly raise questions from your party, and watching them deliver the killing blow to the necromancer that killed their father will resolve those questions in an epic way. DMs, another quick tip, give your players time to communicate between rounds. These are professional adventurers that have been fighting together for a long time. It's okay for them to have a preternatural sense of what's happening on the battlefield, and it'll give your players time to figure out what they're doing with their turns. If you want to keep it structured, have each player describe in initiative order what they're going to do with this round of combat. Remember, each round of combat is meant to be taking place simultaneously over 6 seconds. It's chaotic, but your players are well trained and coordinated. Now that we've covered players, let's talk about your encounters. The first and most important piece of an encounter is knowing why it's happening. DMs, stop building piñatas. You know, those big meatbag encounters with enemies that have lots of HP but really don't pose a threat. The biggest thing that slows down a session is having unnecessary and drawn-out combat. Just like your story plot points, your combat should have meaning as well. We're not playing Pokemon. Random encounters in D&D are kind of boring. The next step in knowing why your encounter is happening is knowing why your baddies are doing what they're doing. DMs, know thyself. Or at least your bad guys. How do your monsters react during combat? There's a great blog and series of books called The Monsters Know What They're Doing that gives you tactics for each kind of monster in the monster manual. I'll put a link in the description. I'm going to do a more in-depth video on monster tactics and reactions in the future, and when I do, I'll leave a card here. Now, once you know your bad guys, you'll need to know your players. Write down their initiatives, their modifiers, and any interesting weapons or abilities that they might have. Then use that information to help you craft interesting and engaging encounters. Finally, know the environment and the terrain of your encounters. Do the bad guys know the area well? Are there any things that you should describe to your players that might make the combat more interesting? For example, if your players are raiding a bandit camp, there's a good chance that the bandits will know the ins and outs of the area in and around their camp. There's also a good chance that those barrels of alcohol that they just stole might make for an interesting combat choice for your wizard who knows fireball. The bandit leader may be willing to sacrifice his grunts to hold down the barbarian while he strolls in to deliver blow after blow at advantage. Knowing the environment and terrain will help you utilize your bad guys to a greater extent. Here's a couple more tips for making sure that your encounters don't slow to a crawl. First, lower your enemy HP. The HP for monsters in the monster manual is just a suggestion, and by lowering it, you can make combat faster and more hard-hitting. Second, increase your bad guys' damage. By making your enemies more fragile, but more painful to your party, you can really speed up the pace of encounters. You can increase damage in a number of ways. You can add new monsters, but remember that every new monster you add adds more HP to the pool that your players have to whittle down before the encounter is over. Or you could increase the damage die or the attack modifiers that they have. A lot of DMs base encounters on challenge rating, but it can be just as useful to base them on total average HP and total average damage of both your parties and the bad guys. Knowing those two things will give you an idea of how long your encounter will last. One more very specific and niche recommendation: put a limit on the number of times that a zombie can use Undead Fortitude. That ability can technically make combat last forever, and that's kind of just honestly absurd. I recommend giving it a limit of like 3 or 4 times per zombie. Next up, let's cover action. Another great way to speed up the perception of your combat is to make it more engaging. Narrate the scenario, explaining what's in the environment and the terrain. Point out anything that might be interesting to your players. Remember the barrels from earlier? Even if you aren't a great voice actor, it can be a lot of fun to add sound effects to the engaging moments of your combat. What does it sound like when an arrow hits the eye stalk of a beholder? When you get to a player in a round of combat, make sure to narrate a little bit of what just happened. Like I said, combat's about 6 seconds long, so it doesn't take very long to remind them that their barbarian is raging in or that their wizard is casting fireball. One of the biggest things that can slow down your combat is waiting for your players to decide what they want to do. Give them a time limit, and if they don't make a decision in that time, they automatically take the dodge action. Combining this with the idea of battle readiness and allowing your players to talk in between rounds is a great way to speed up the entirety of your combat. In addition, reward your players for doing interesting things. When your fighter decides to leap off a balcony to skewer one of the enemies that's terrorizing the crowd below, give them an inspiration dice that they can use on their acrobatics roll, damage roll, or attack roll. This incentivizes your players to do more interesting things than just trade blows back and forth with your enemies. Finally, remember it's okay for combat to end early. Once the boss is dead, maybe the minions have started to run away. This can lead right into a chase scene, which can be a super engaging moment. If your bad guys know the environment and terrain really well, maybe they disappear into hidey holes that your players had no idea even existed. When running isn't an option, most enemies will take the choice to surrender. This gives your players a great moment of roleplay when they decide what they want to do with this bad guy. Sure, most of the time they'll probably just kill them, but maybe it'll derail the quest that they're on while they try to take this enemy back to the guards in town. Finally, if your bad guys have a goal beyond kill the players, which they should, think about what happens when they achieve that goal. If the rebels kidnap the princess, they're not going to stick around trading blows with your party. They're going to run away. Next up, resources. We've already talked about a lot of this in many of the other points above, but make sure you have written down what your resources you and your players have at hand. Once again, this includes environment and terrain, but it also includes the actions your players and bad guys can take. If the group of bandits has a larger clan down the road, they're not just going to sit around waiting to be killed by your players. Make sure you write down your major resources. In the heat of battle, it can be hard to remember all the things that you can do. If you're using monster tactics, like from the Monsters Know What They're Doing that I mentioned earlier, write down a couple simple if-then statements so you can keep track. If the bandit leader dies, then the bandits will run away. If the players approach cautiously, then the mother owlbear may not attack. Knowing what can happen will help you figure out what will happen. Finally, keep track of the layers of your combats. Know your bad guys' goals on an individual and group level. Give some of them interesting conditions like cowardly or foolhardy, and then act on those conditions the way that those characters would act in combat. Know your players' goals too. Are they the kind of group that'll fight to the last man? Do they prefer to resolve things non-violently? What kinds of secondary plots could keep your players engaged in the moment? Maybe they're carrying a priceless heirloom and trying to protect that over just simply attacking the enemies. Finally, know the points at which your session needs combat. Don't just throw enemies at your players for the sake of combat. Know where your bad guys are thematically, and give your players combat as an option to resolve the scenario. Sometimes fighting is inevitable, but just as often, there are other ways around the situation. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed my Pearl of Wisdom. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments how you speed up your combat, and remember, stay wizardly.